excerpt from Tom Merchant's address to the Eustis.
Faster!
Okay. An excerpt from Tom Merchant's address to the Eustis Cultural Women's Auxiliary and Temperance Society.
Excuse me, Mr. Merchant, the people want to know, what is an e-book? Well, first off, let me say I'm very pleased with the success of our e-books. On one hand, I am a bit surprised at just how popular they really are. When we first decided to delve into ebooks, I had a lot of trepidation. That is to say, I didn't think we could reach the same level of success that we had with other formats such as books. I will spare you the details of the types of bindings and their relative values in terms of cost-effectiveness and durability. When I was at Follett, and we started with a traditional bound book format, there was of course a lot of resistance from the public and the community at large at first. However, once libraries found a way to shelve these things that we'll now call books, and categorize them in a way that made sense not only for the librarian, but for the patron who was looking for a particular item, well, we knew we had something that was useful. This book format is one that the libraries have been using for quite some time now. In some literary circles, some would say it's been relevant since Gutenberg invented the printing press. You know, it really is an interesting story about the Hollander device and how it enhanced the speed with which mankind could make paper. I think the only remaining Hollander device is at the Follett headquarters in Montana. In fact, I was the Hollander rep in the tri-state area after my stint in the Air Force, which is where I first learned how to bind paper using classified information. But wait, let me back up here for a second. I would be remiss to mention that before books, people printed information on paper scrolls. In fact, the libraries of the Middle Ages consisted of rows and rows of holders for these scrolls. If someone came into a library wanting a particular scroll, the librarian, well, of course they weren't called librarians at the time, but rather scroll keepers, would have to unroll each scroll until they found the relevant information. Of course, this made for a lot of tedious work for the scroll keeper, and the time that it took for the patron to access the information was unspecified amount of time. Besides the scroll keeper, there were people that were called scrollologgers, who would attempt to keep these scrolls in some semblance of order. When the library became large enough, these scrollologgers would have to classify these scrolls, and sometimes they would have to use up to 14 abacus points past the decimal in order to exactly classify these scrolls in a meaningful format. The problem became that you couldn't fit that many abacus beads on the spine of a scroll. Odd, really. Well, even more fascinating than keeping records on scrolls is the idea that the ancient Sumerians used to record information on pieces of papyrus. Well, papyrus was really nothing more than dried up leaves. The Sumerians had to dry these leaves in the hot desert sun, sometimes up to 2 to 3 months at a time, just to get enough leaves to make a recipe or a shopping list. Well, then they would take these leaves and etch them with peacock feathers. Well, of course they didn't have pens in ancient Sumeria, so they would have to get ink from giant squids in the Mediterranean. Since giant squids are very elusive, boatmen would have to spend years at a time searching for these squids until they had enough ink to bring back to their village. Well, anyway, after writing whatever information it was that they wanted to write on a piece of papyrus with a peacock feather dipped in giant squid ink, the Sumerians would take the finished product to their library for storage. The Sumerians had giant sarcophagi in which they kept these stacks and stacks of papyrus leaves. Well, you can imagine how many sarcophagi it took to store each of these piles of leaves. What's funny is that when people moved from stone tablets to papyrus, it was the papyrus leaves themselves that were used to burn in their kilns before the tablets were fired. What I think is really important here is that the Muslim Spring was really brought about by some of the work that we were doing at Follett. The library in Alexandria, in fact, has the Follett Rebellion module. But before I can finish this story, though, I think I need to back up a little bit and tell you another story, just to put it into appropriate context for you. You can see how things have progressed when compared to how the ancient Egyptians stored information in their libraries before the invention of papyrus. As you know, all early civilizations had to record data in those days were stone tablets. So your everyday writer, or we'll just call him chiseler, had to spend years and years hacking information into these enormous 500-pound stone tablets. And these tablets had to be excavated from a remote cavern which could be sometimes 1,000 miles away. To make just one measly sign, for example, it would take 400 or 500 slaves to move that particular sign and place it where you wanted it to go. Well, as you can see, anything that you wanted codified into law, for example, and put on display for the public would take decades of meticulous chiseling just to make it accessible and readable for the public. You know, the stone tablets of the Egyptians were in fact child's play compared to how the early Neanderthal man captured his data. As we've all seen in movies like Quest for Fire, or 1 Million BC, or even Caveman starring Ringo Starr, the Neanderthal man painted in caves. The only way they could store and retrieve information was to draw these pictographs in any particular cave. In fact, this is funny, the earliest libraries were nothing more than the largest, most centralized caves, which were then painted to portray any kind of information that you wanted to convey. Well, as you can imagine, it became exceedingly difficult to utilize space once these caves got filled up with a lot of paintings. So whenever the library cave got full, the entire tribe had to move to an entirely new location, which would have to be a cave system big enough for not only the inhabitants of the tribe, but as well as the new library. So, as you can see, this would have made life very difficult for the Neanderthal man. It was bad enough that these early men had to deal with a crude library system, but the daily fear of dinosaurs with laser beams on their heads was a constant threat. These laser beam shooting space dinosaurs were really a precursor to libraries in a way that, well, it's really out of context for the conversation we're having here, but nonetheless is tantamount to the long term. But I digress. What was the question again?